Most people grow up hearing the same quiet instruction, even if no one ever says it out loud. Pick one thing, stick to it, become known for it. Modern life loves clean labels. You're a designer, a marketer, a developer, a writer, a strategist, something that fits neatly into a bio, a resume, a single line of explanation. It makes the world easier to understand you, and maybe easier for you to explain yourself too. But then there's you. You're interested in too many things. One week you're obsessed with systems and strategy, next psychology, then storytelling, then business, then art, then something else entirely. Your curiosity doesn't move in a straight line. It branches, it overlaps, it loops back on itself. And somewhere along the way, a quiet doubt starts forming. Is this a lack of focus, or is it something else? Because from the outside, it can look messy, scattered, uncommitted, like you're always starting and never arriving. But inside, it doesn't feel random at all. It feels connected, like everything you're drawn to is circling the same core questions, just from different angles. So why does having many interests feel both like a gift and a liability at the same time? Here's the contradiction no one talks about. We live in a world that rewards specialization, but we're moving toward a future that quietly depends on integration. The systems are more complex, careers are less linear, problems don't stay in their lanes anymore, and yet we still measure people by how narrow and defined they are. Psychologically, people with many interests often struggle not because they lack discipline, but because they possess too much awareness. Your mind doesn't settle easily because it sees connections everywhere. You don't just want to do the thing, you want to understand the thing behind the thing, and that can be exhausting. You might notice this pattern in yourself. You learn something deeply, then instead of stopping there, your brain asks, okay, but how does this connect to everything else? That's not a distraction, that's synthesis. It's the mind trying to build a bigger map. But culturally, we mislabel that as indecision. We assume people with many interests are avoiding commitment, chasing novelty, or lacking self-restraint. But often, it's the opposite. It takes restraint to not collapse your identity into the first role that gives you validation. It takes patience to sit with unfinished curiosity instead of rushing to declare, "This is who I am." There's a subtle psychological tension here around identity. Most people use careers as identity anchors. I am what I do. It provides certainty, external validation, a sense of place. But when you have multiple interests, no single role feels big enough to hold you. And that can feel unsettling in a world that asks for simple answers. So you start wondering, what's wrong with me? Nothing, but something different is happening. People with many interests often have a strong internal locus of control. Their sense of direction comes from internal curiosity rather than external approval. They're not just responding to what the world rewards, they're responding to what makes sense to them. And that can create friction because the world doesn't always know how to reward that. Dopamine plays a role here too, but not in the way people assume. It's easy to say, you just chase new things because you get bored. But boredom isn't the driver, meaning is. Once something becomes repetitive or purely performative, the dopamine drops, not because it's hard, but because it no longer feels alive. You're not addicted to novelty, you're allergic to stagnation. And that's where emotional burnout quietly enters the picture. When you're forced to compress yourself into a single track that doesn't reflect your inner complexity, something drains. You start performing focus instead of experiencing engagement. You keep going, but you feel less like yourself the longer you do. This is where the idea of the M-shaped future becomes interesting. Instead of a single upward line of expertise, some people are built for multiple peaks, depth in more than one domain. Not shallow knowledge everywhere, but meaningful competence across connected areas. Strategy and psychology, creativity and systems, thinking and building. But here's the part that doesn't get said enough. Living that way requires a different kind of psychological security. When your identity isn't tied to one title, you have to generate your own sense of coherence. You have to trust that the through line exists even when others can't see it yet. That takes quiet confidence, a willingness to be misunderstood for a while. And sometimes you retreat, not because you're lost, but because you're integrating. Psychological ownership matters here. When you're learning or experimenting privately, the ideas feel more yours,
untouched by comparison or judgment. The moment you explain it too early, that ownership weakens. Suddenly, you're defending something that's still forming. So you stay quiet, you think, you connect dots internally before you share anything externally. Of course, silence isn't always healthy. Sometimes withdrawal hides fear. Fear of choosing wrong. Fear of being judged for not being serious enough. Fear that if you commit to one path, you'll betray another part of yourself. That tension is real, and it deserves compassion, not dismissal. But there's also a quieter truth underneath it all. Some people aren't meant to optimize for speed. They're meant to optimize for understanding. Noise versus silence shows up here again. The noise says, pick a lane, brand yourself, be consistent. The silence says, let me make sense of this first. One is about performance, the other is about authenticity. And authenticity is slower. It doesn't always look impressive in real time. It looks like wandering, like detours, like pauses that don't translate well on resumes. But internally, something solid is forming, a mental model of how the world works, how people think, how systems interact, how meaning is created. You start realizing that your interests aren't competing, they're cooperating. And that changes how you see success. It stops being about external approval and starts becoming about internal peace. Not the peace of settling, but the peace of alignment, when what you're doing makes sense to who you are. There's something philosophical about this too. In a culture obsessed with outputs, having many interests pulls you back into presence. You're not just chasing outcomes, you're paying attention to patterns, to nuance, to what feels true instead of what looks impressive. Not everything meaningful can be optimized. Some things need to be lived into. And maybe that's why people like you feel ahead and behind at the same time. Ahead in understanding, behind in visible milestones. It's uncomfortable, but it's also a sign that your identity isn't being outsourced to applause. So let me ask you something. What if your many interests aren't a problem to solve, but a structure to grow into? What if the confusion you feel is actually integration happening in real time? And what if the future you're built for doesn't reward narrowness at all, but depth across dimensions? The world is changing quietly. Careers are becoming less like ladders and more like ecosystems. The people who thrive won't just know one thing well, they'll know how things connect, how to translate, how to synthesize, how to move between worlds without losing themselves. And that might be you. Not scattered, not unfocused, just multidimensional in a world that hasn't fully caught up yet. You don't need to rush the explanation. You don't need to collapse into a label. Some identities are meant to stay spacious, to evolve, to hold contradictions without breaking. Because in the end, the people with many interests aren't trying to do everything. They're trying to understand something fully. And that kind of depth doesn't announce itself loudly. It unfolds quietly over time.